Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time into the heart of ancient Sparta, a land where silence spoke louder than words, where children were sculpted not with affection, but with discipline, and where glory was carved into the skin like a scar. As you settle in for a restorative sleep or a moment of calm, I invite your mind to drift along the weathered hills and through the dim corridors of this stark society, where even the youngest were trained to fear nothing but the softness within themselves. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle, historical journeys. And if you resonate with this soft and immersive style of storytelling, a quiet click on the subscribe button would be much appreciated. It's thoughtful listeners like you who keep this series of historical tales flowing smoothly. Perhaps right now, you're lying in the quiet darkness of your room, searching for something to slow your thoughts. The hum of modern life might still echo faintly in your ears, perhaps the tick of a clock, the far-off whoosh of a car passing in the night, or the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Let them fade, one by one, as if you were stepping out of time. Let the present dissolve like steam into the silence. Now imagine the dry breath of the Peloponnesian wind on your skin, rough, gritty with the fine dust of limestone and red earth. You are barefoot on uneven stone, the ground warm from the fading sun. Around you rise the harsh outlines of Spartan houses, low, unadorned, heavy with silence. The air smells of iron from weapons and of sweat soaked into thick woolen tunics. From a distance, the faint metallic clatter of shields being stacked echoes briefly, then vanishes into the stillness. You pass through a narrow street where every step resounds louder than it should. Spartan streets were not built for chatter, but for passage. Windows are shuttered. Doorways are guarded by silence. There is no music, no laughter, no scent of bread baking, no idle voices of children playing. Only discipline, only the weight of expectation pressing against your shoulders like armor. This is not the Sparta of legends, nor the Sparta of films with roaring warriors charging into glorious battle. This is the Sparta that waited behind closed doors, the Sparta of bruises hidden under leather straps, of tears swallowed before they reached the throat, of young boys clutching empty stomachs in the night, learning to pretend it didn't matter. The Sparta of mothers who learned to love without protection, of fathers who taught their sons not to speak, but to endure. A world where the human spirit was not nurtured, but hammered, honed, and hardened until it no longer resembled something soft or tender. Tonight we walk not beside kings or heroes, but among the forgotten, the boys who trembled quietly before punishment, the young who never cried when they were left alone in the dark because they had been taught that silence was the only armor that mattered. We will see their world through their eyes, feel their days through their skin, the calloused feet, the aching limbs after endless drills, the cold of stone floors against the cheek at night. We will listen to the quiet fear inside them, the one they were never allowed to name. The stories we'll uncover are not easy. They are not glorious, but they are real. And in their quiet suffering, in their daily strength, there is something deeply human, perhaps something you'll recognize in yourself. Because even now, even in your quiet room, under your blanket or stretched out on your couch, you may feel that same exhaustion, that quiet pressure to be strong, that ache that never quite goes away, that sense of being expected to carry more than anyone sees. Let this story be a place to lay it down. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breath grow deeper, longer. You don't need to do anything else. Just listen. The journey is already beginning. The stones of Sparta are still warm beneath your feet. The night has settled. The silence is waiting, and through that silence, we will walk together. The first light of day had not yet touched the sharp outlines of the Taygetos Mountains. The land still lay cloaked in the dark blue hush of early morning, a silence so dense it seemed to press against the skin like cool linen. And in that liminal hour, when the air is neither night nor day, a newborn's cry could rise, a soft, tremulous echo between stone walls. Not welcomed, not celebrated, simply evaluated. In ancient Sparta, life did not begin with lullabies or the comforting hush of a mother's whisper. There were no kisses placed on damp foreheads, no swaddling arms to protect a fragile body from the world's hardness. Instead, there was scrutiny. The ritual was not whispered. It was observed, cold, precise. Unyielding, the midwife, hands calloused from decades of service, would lift the child from blood-streaked straw and wrap him not in a blanket of affection, but in a thin cloth meant only to protect against the morning chill. The mother, barely breathing from her labor, would watch with wide, emptied eyes as the small bundle was taken from her arms. Her body ached not just with childbirth, but with knowing that love was not permission. That the next hours would decide if she had a son or a wound that could not be named. Along stone corridors, under ceilings stained with soot from oil lamps, the infant would be brought to the council of elders, stooped men whose lives had long been chiseled by discipline, whose eyes no longer saw in shades of tenderness. They did not coo, nor smile, nor reach out their hands. They studied. Every joint, every curve of the spine, every twitch of muscle. The room smelled of old sweat, of oiled wood and smoke. In the background, a low fire crackled, its warmth doing nothing to ease the chill that settled around the examination bench. The child's skin, still slick with birth, shivered in the dim light. They listened for a cry, a healthy cry, a strong cry, not the mule of a weakling. Was the boy's back straight? Were his eyes symmetrical? Did he flinch too easily when exposed to cold? A slight tremor, a limp arm, a delayed breath, any of these could mean the sentence. The mother would not be told directly. The verdict passed silently, through gesture, through ritual. The elder's eyes did not meet hers, and within hours, sometimes less, the child would be wrapped again, not for warmth, not for protection, but for the journey to Taygetos. The path to the mountain was steep, lined with gnarled olive trees and harsh, scrubby grass that grew where the soil was thin and the sun relentless. Each step up the trail echoed in the hush of dawn, as though the earth itself refused to speak. Somewhere below, the Eurotas River whispered its slow song, but higher, on that ridge above the valley, there was only wind and stone, and silence. At the edge of a chasm, jagged and deep, the child would be left. No prayers were uttered. No names were spoken. The rocks beneath the bundle were cold and hard. Some say they were stained. Others say they were bare, wiped clean by the passage of time. But the memory lingered in the land, as if the ground had learned to carry grief in its silence. Some of these children may have lived a little longer, clinging to breath, to instinct, to the sheer force of being. Others faded quickly, their cries swallowed by the canyon winds. No one returned for them. That, too, was law. And what of the mothers, those whose wombs had nurtured life, now emptied into forgetting? They were expected to carry on, to bear again, to hope again, but not to speak, never to speak. Their mourning was internal, locked behind dry eyes and tightened lips. To grieve openly was weakness. To ask, why was rebellion? And so, they learned to walk past the absence, to speak of nothing, to look into the eyes of other children and wonder, what if? For the Spartan state, this was not cruelty. It was function. It was purification. The polis had no room for fragility, for illness, for difference. The body was a weapon. and only the finest would be forged. But underneath that rigid order lay the echo of small lives that never began. The ghosts of infants who were measured and discarded like broken tools, no names, no burial stones, only the cold embrace of Tegetus and the collective silence of a people taught never to question. So let us hold that silence for a moment longer, dear listener. Let us linger in the wind at the mountain's edge. Let us feel the stone beneath our hands, the coldness of that place. Let us imagine the aching emptiness of a mother's breast and the unbearable stillness of a swaddled child no longer moving. And as we descend now, gently back into the valley, we carry with us not the myth of Spartan strength, but its cost. Because every legend begins in shadow. And in Sparta, that shadow was born from silence. The boy is 7 years old. He wakes before dawn, not because he must, but because sleep has become shallow, disturbed by the dread that settles each night like a second skin. The mat beneath him is coarse, made of straw bundled too tight. It smells faintly of old sweat, of dust, of the oil his mother rubbed into his scalp the night before. Her hands had trembled ever so slightly, though she said nothing. No goodbye. Only silence, held together with the weight of everything she could not say. Outside, the air is cool and sharp. A fog lingers in the early light, low over the hills. Birds stir in the olive trees, their songs thin and hesitant. But there are no lullabies in Sparta, no stories at bedtime, only the quiet thud of sandals on packed earth and the distant crack of discipline being taught elsewhere. This morning is not like others. Today the boy becomes the property of the state, the agage. The word is soft on the tongue, but it does not feel soft. It means leading, but it also means separation. As the sun begins to climb the pale sky, a figure appears at the door, a man in his middle years, wrapped in the dark red cloak of Sparta. His voice is low, formal. The boy's name is called, but not with warmth. There is no embracing farewell. The mother stands to the side, her eyes fixed on a distant spot beyond the threshold. She has done this before. Her own brothers walk this path. She knows she must not cry. The boy, sensing her stillness, mimics it. He bites the inside of his cheek, tastes the metal of his own resolve, and steps forward. He walks into a new life. The dormitories of the agage are made of stone, their floors worn smooth by generations of small, bare feet. The light here is dim, even at midday. The smell is unmistakable. Sweat, leather, smoke, and the faint iron of blood from unhealed scrapes. Everything is controlled. Even the silence. No child speaks without reason. Every sound is measured. The strike of heel against floor, the clatter of a bowl, the groan of stiff muscles in the cold morning. The boys sleep side by side on thin pallets. There are no pillows, no blankets, save for a single coarse cloth. Cold is not a discomfort, it is a lesson. Hunger is not a mistake, it is a condition. Comfort is neither expected nor offered. Discipline arrives in the form of a staff across the back, or a meal denied, or hours spent standing motionless in the sun until the body trembles but does not fall. Affection is scarce, laughter even rarer. To laugh freely is to be noticed, and to be noticed is to be tested. They are taught to move in silence, to obey without hesitation, to endure without expression. Each boy becomes not an individual, but a piece of a greater machine. Their hair is cut short. Their voices are trained into monotone. Their hands learn the texture of rough rope, of cold metal, of blood dried beneath fingernails. The pain is not just physical, it is the absence of the smell of a mother's skin, of whispered stories at dusk, of being touched without purpose, of being told, simply, that one matters. Here, in the agage, Every boy is alone, even when surrounded. They are watched, always, not for who they are, but for what they may become. Weakness is hunted, not comforted. Crying is punished, hesitation is mocked, and longing is devoured in the dark, behind closed eyes and breaths that must not tremble. Some boys adapt. They harden like clay left too long in the sun. Others fracture invisibly, the cracks hidden behind taut jaws and clenched fists. At night, when the barracks fall into silence and the oil lamps flicker low, a boy might press his face against the stone wall, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the breathing of those beside him. Not one voice whispers, not one word is spoken. It is the kind of silence that feels sharp against the eardrum, a silence so deep it echoes in the bones. Outside, the moon drifts across the sky. Somewhere, perhaps not far, his mother lies awake, her hand on the empty mat, her body remembering the weight that is no longer there. This, too, is Sparta, a place where the first true lesson a child learns is how to be alone, how to bury his softness, how to become steel, not in body alone, but in spirit. And yet, within every silent breath, every clenched jaw, there remains a pulse of something else, something not broken, but caged. The boy will not cry, he will not speak. But the silence he carries is not emptiness. It is a presence, heavy, enduring, a memory of something lost before it had the chance to grow. And so the days begin. And so the boy becomes what Sparta demands. And what he must abandon to do so, he is everything that once made him human. The stomach growls before the sun rises. In the dim barracks of the Agage, boys lie still beneath thin coverings, their bodies curled inward, not from fear, but from hunger. It is a constant presence, sharper than the morning chill, louder than the footfalls of the instructor approaching. Hunger is no accident here. It is part of the design, a deliberate absence, a lesson carved into the body. Food in Sparta was rationed to the edge of survival. The portions were meager, coarse barley bread, a ladle of black broth made from pig's blood, vinegar, and herbs. It clung to the bowl in thick streaks. The smell was acrid, metallic. It filled the nostrils with a bitterness that lingered long after the meal was gone. And it was always gone too soon. The body grew lean, not by natural rhythm, but by policy, a deliberate thinning. The boy's ribs became more visible with time, their cheeks hollow, their muscles wiry from constant exertion and insufficient sustenance. But in Sparta, thinness was not weakness. It was strategy. They were told they could steal, not encouraged, but permitted if they could do it well. It was not the theft itself that mattered, but the skill it required, cunning, stealth, silence. These were virtues. The ability to move unseen, to calculate the moment when a piece of bread might vanish from the mess, to judge when a distracted cook turned his back. These were early lessons in survival, in tactics, in war. But being caught, being seen, was unforgivable. The punishment was not for the act, but for the failure. A boy who stole bread and remained unnoticed might carry a secret satisfaction beneath his tunic, but one who was discovered would be flogged publicly, not with rage, but with cold method. The beatings took place in the training yards where dry earth cracked beneath bare feet and the dust clung to skin like a second layer. The rod left stripes that burned for days. The other boys were made to watch. Some turned their eyes downward. Others watched too closely, learning the price of carelessness. The pain was not only in the welts, it was in the exposure. Still, they continued to steal. The hunger never relented. It gnawed behind the ribs, dulled the senses, made sleep thin and dreamless. A boy might wake in the middle of the night, not from fear, but from emptiness. His mouth dry, his belly aching, his fingers twitching with the memory of food he did not eat, and yet the desire to survive pushed him forward. Every stolen fig, every snatched crust, became a small act of rebellion and of obedience. There were stories passed in hushed tones about a boy who had once hidden a fox cub beneath his cloak. He had stolen it to prove his skill, but when he was questioned by an elder and dared not reveal his crime, he remained still. The fox, trapped and panicked, bit into the boy's side, tore flesh, drew blood. He did not flinch. He did not cry. He stood there unmoving as the animal gnawed through to bone. When they found him, he was dead, but he had not been caught, and that in Sparta was the greater victory. What does it mean to be taught that silence is greater than pain, that cunning is more valuable than honesty, that food, the most basic comfort, must be taken in secret like guilt? For the boys of the agoge, these lessons were not symbolic, they were embodied. They lived within the ache of an empty stomach, in the tremble of a hand reaching out in darkness, in the breath held as footsteps passed too close. This was not merely training, it was shaping. Each boy was being molded into something more than a soldier, or perhaps something less than human. They learned not just how to fight, but how to suppress compassion, how to trade warmth for strategy, how to survive at the cost of trust. Hunger taught them not to rely on others, not to share. To take what they could and suffer the consequences alone if they failed. And in this quiet, feral discipline, a new kind of person emerged, one who knew the taste of fear behind every stolen crumb, one who could look into the eyes of a companion, knowing they might compete for the same scrap, one who would one day march to war without hesitation, because the first war had already begun, inside their own hollow belly, the war against want, the war against weakness. And perhaps most cruel of all, the war against tenderness. The arena is not grand. There are no towering coliseums here, no polished marble stands, no ceremonial trumpets. Only a dusty clearing encircled by worn stone benches and the shadows of cypress trees. The midday sun hangs heavy above, flattening the landscape into dry heat and stillness. Dust swirls gently in the air, disturbed by bare feet shifting restlessly on packed earth. The scent of sweat is thick, metallic, mingling with the faint sweetness of crushed thyme trampled underfoot. Boys stand in a ring. Their bodies are lean and marked, not only by training, but by the countless small battles they have already endured. Their shoulders are squared, not with confidence, but with expectation. Their hands are clenched, the skin on their knuckles raw. There is no instruction, no encouragement, only silence and the distant murmur of the crowd settling in. This is the Platonistas, a ritual, a spectacle, a lesson. Two boys step forward. They are nearly the same height, their expressions unreadable. The rules are simple. There are no weapons, only fists, and whatever rage or fear one can summon in the moment. There is no bell to start the match, only the gesture of a trainer's hand slicing through the air, a signal as quiet as it is final. And then it begins. The first sound is a grunt, low and strained, then the slap of skin against skin. Dust rises as bodies shift and fall. A foot scrapes the ground, finding leverage. A shoulder twists violently, muscle straining. A gasp is bitten back. Blood appears quickly, first as a smear across the cheek, then as a drip from a split lip, then as a line down the side of a rib cage. The wounds are not deep, not yet. But they are public. The crowd watches in silence. Not the silence of indifference, but of study. Fathers, elders, even mothers sit with expressions carved from stone. Their eyes follow every movement, every mistake, every hesitation. The boys know this. They feel the weight of it pressing in from every direction. To cry out is unthinkable. To fall without rising again is shame. But to win without revealing pain, that is the goal. These matches are not rare. They are woven into the rhythm of Spartan life, a normal part of a boy's week, a test not of strength alone, but of endurance, of emotional absence. To flinch is weakness. To bleed is expected. To bleed and not react, that is virtue. Some boys fight with fury, fists swinging wildly until exhaustion pulls them down. Others fight with eerie calm, their strikes measured, their eyes flat. Each style is watched, noted, judged. There are no cheers, no applause, only the occasional nod from an elder, the sharp inhalation of a mother when her child stumbles, quickly hidden behind pursed lips. The ground beneath them becomes stained over time. Not red but darkened, subtle reminders of matches past. The dust holds stories in silence. And what of the boys who do not fight? There are none. Participation is not optional. Even the smallest must step forward when called. Even the slowest. Even the ones who wake with nightmares and fists clenched to their own chest. What does it do to a child to be made a performer of pain? To know that suffering is a show, and that the audience does not look away. The boy who fights today will sleep tonight, with bruises blossoming beneath his skin, aching ribs, perhaps a cut across the brow, but it is not the pain that lingers. It is the awareness that his body belongs to the polis, that his strength is currency, that his silence is expected, demanded, rewarded. And the crowd? They will rise quietly when the match ends. They will walk away through the olive trees, their sandals kicking up soft clouds of dust, their conversations returning to crops, to news from the borders, to matters of state. The boy will remain, not physically. He will return to his barracks, wash the blood from his skin with cold water, bind his own wounds if necessary, but a part of him will stay in that ring, in the gaze of the watchers, in the dust that remembers. Because in Sparta, pain is not private, it is performance. And every boy learns sooner or later that the truest lesson is not how to win, it is how to hurt, without flinching. The day in Sparta ends not with softness, but with subtraction. As the last slivers of sunlight withdraw behind the distant hills, the entire world seems to pause. The red-tinted sky fades into a leaden dusk, then into a heavy, seamless dark. There are no candles flickering in windows, no crackling hearths where stories are shared. The fire pits have been extinguished. Voices are stilled. Shadows deepen. The transition is neither warm nor gradual. It is an erasure. Inside the stone barracks of the Agoj, the air has grown dense and still. The stone walls absorb the day's heat, but release none of its comfort. The scent of worn leather lingers in the room, sandals discarded at the foot of each cot, their straps stiff with use. There is the metallic tang of dried sweat, the earthy note of straw beds, slowly fermenting under weeks of unwashed bodies. The atmosphere is close, almost airless, but no one dares to complain. The boys lie flat, unmoving, their backs rigid against straw mats, their limbs stiff beneath coarse woolen coverings. The wool itches where it touches skin. Some boys pull it tightly to their necks, as if bracing against a wind that never comes. Others lie uncovered, their chests rising and falling slowly, rhythmically, rehearsed into stillness. No one speaks. Words here have been outlawed by the night. The silence is not passive. It is enforced, not with threats, but with history, with knowledge, with the understanding that any sound, a whisper, a sigh, even the involuntary gasp of a troubled dream, can summon punishment. And so the dormitory becomes a tomb of wakefulness, a place where breath is the only permitted language, and even that must be quiet. There are no lullabies in this darkness, no voices to soothe, no arms to shelter, no gentle murmurs that say, "You are safe." Instead, the boys are left with only their thoughts. But even those are not free, because in this place, to think too loudly is to remember, and to remember is to ache. Some of them stare upward, though they cannot see the ceiling. The darkness is absolute, so total that it seems to close around the body, not just visually, but physically. It presses inward, compressing thought and sensation. For some, this is comforting. For others, suffocating. The silence has weight. It fills the ears like water. It creeps into the chest, urging the heart to beat more softly, more slowly, as though fearing that even its pulse might draw notice. To live here is to become invisible, not only to others, but to oneself. There are boys who cry, not loudly, never aloud. Their tears are silent, absorbed into straw or cloth, their shoulders trembling with practiced restraint. They have learned to cry without breath, without sound, without consequence. Others do not sleep at all. They lie with eyes wide open, staring into nothing, waiting for the night to pass. They count the seconds not in numbers, but in muscle twitches, in itches ignored, in the burning strain of holding a position too long. Time drips forward like a leaking vessel, unseen, but felt in the joints, in the dry mouth, in the longing for morning's light. But morning does not promise relief. It promises drills and discipline and the return of commands barked through clenched teeth. And so the boys linger in the night, caught between exhaustion and anticipation, between pain and the dread of more. In this nightly ritual of imposed stillness, a lesson is carved into the flesh, not with rods or whips, but with the quiet, with the denial of expression, with the removal of warmth. Over time, the silence does not just surround them, it enters them. It shapes their sleep, dulls their dreams, replaces softness with vigilance. The imagination contracts, the inner voice goes quiet. Emotion flattens into obedience. The boy becomes a shadow of himself, disciplined, controlled, silent. And that silence, once foreign, becomes familiar. It becomes identity. What is a child who never spoke in the dark? What becomes of the spirit when every night is a rehearsal in erasure? Even now, in the deepest part of the night, some of the boys do not realize they are awake. Their minds drift just beneath consciousness, hovering in a liminal place where no images form, only a gray quiet. Awaiting. Outside, the world sleeps in its natural rhythm. Crickets chirp in the grasses beyond the city. The river hums softly in its bed. But those sounds do not reach here. This dormitory is closed not only in architecture, but in spirit. It is a sealed vessel, a chamber where noise is disobedience, and sleep is not rest, but conformity. And so they lie still, boys molded into stone, their softness buried beneath discipline, their voices forgotten beneath the hush of survival. Because in Sparta, sleep was not the surrender of consciousness, it was the training ground of silence. There is a moment, brief, invisible, when pain crosses the threshold between endurance and emotion, when the body reacts faster than discipline can silence it. A flinch, a sharp intake of breath, the sudden tightening of the eyes, and sometimes a tear. In Sparta, that tear was treason. The sun is high, casting hard shadows across the training yard. The heat presses against the skin like a second weight, drawn into the pores by the sweat that never quite dries. Dust rises with every footfall, clinging to ankles, to knees, to the hems of tunics, already stiff from days of use. The boys move in formation, each gesture sharp and timed, each command obeyed before it is finished being spoken. A mistake happens, a stumble, a blow landed too hard. The boy falls, and silence swells. Not the compassionate kind that gives space, but the sharp kind that cuts. He presses his palms into the earth to rise. His lip is bleeding, one eye already swelling. And as he lifts his head, something gives way, barely, almost imperceptibly. The corners of his mouth tremble. His eyes, red from dust and sun, begin to glisten. A single tear rolls down his cheek, and in that moment, he is no longer a soldier in training. He is a boy, a child. But the crowd does not see a child. They see a failure. Laughter erupts, not loud, not joyous, but pointed, cold, rehearsed. A ritual humiliation passed down from one cohort to the next. Some boys smirk behind their hands, others stare in silence, grateful the shame is not theirs for today. The instructors say nothing. They do not need to. The lesson is complete. From the earliest age, Spartan boys are taught not simply to be strong, but to be unreadable. To show pain is to expose vulnerability, and vulnerability in this world is weakness. Not just for the self, but for the city, for the name, for the legacy of Sparta. And so emotion is exiled. The pedagogy is clear. Feeling is failure. Crying is punished, not with violence, but with ridicule, with isolation, with a silence that says, you do not belong here unless you bury yourself. Some boys learn to suppress it quickly. They train their faces into masks, their voices into steady tones. They anticipate pain and coat it in numbness. Others struggle longer. They cry in secret, into their arms, into their thin blankets, into the stone corners where shadows pool thickest. But even there, they do not sob, they do not wail. They let the tears fall soundless, like water dripping from a crack in the ceiling, unnoticed, unclaimed. The older boys are worse. They do not console, they do not forgive. They mock, sometimes with a glance, sometimes with a word muttered just loud enough to cut. There is no solidarity in pain, only hierarchy. Younger boys begin to carry their pain deeper. They tuck it beneath layers of silence, behind clenched jaws and hollow eyes. They speak less. They laugh less. Some forget what it means to cry at all. Their bodies remember, but their minds forget. The pathways that once opened so easily, from fear to tears, from pain to comfort, are closed, bricked over by ritual, by fear of shame. And yet, emotion does not die. It changes shape. It becomes anger, resentment, detachment. It curls inside the chest like smoke in a sealed jar, darkening everything it touches, and when it erupts, it does so without warning, often during combat, often against someone smaller, weaker, slower. The cycle continues. What is a life without the permission to feel? What happens when children are told, over and over, that their sorrow has no place in the world? In Sparta, the answer is evident. Boys become hard, and the cracks that form beneath that hardness are never spoken of. Not even to themselves, because to speak is to acknowledge, and to acknowledge is to feel, and to feel is to fall. So they walk in silence, faces unreadable, bodies trained, minds disciplined. But somewhere deep inside, behind the stoic gaze and the steady step, a single tear remains, unfallen, forgotten, frozen in place by the weight of 1,000 eyes that were taught to look away. The slap echoes louder in silence. It slices through the dry morning air, past the cypress shadows stretching long across the training yard. The sound is unmistakable, skin on skin, sharp, deliberate. A boy staggers half a step to the side, not from force, but from the shock of being struck so suddenly. He does not fall, he does not cry. His face burns where the palm landed, the skin already red, the heat spreading like fire trapped beneath the surface. He straightens. The paidonomos stands motionless before him, his face unreadable, not cruel, not angry, just still. The man's hand lowers slowly, as though it had merely performed a necessary motion. The boy's eyes do not meet his. They remain fixed ahead, unfocused, trembling at the edges, but trained by weeks, months of repetition to remain open, always open. This is not punishment, it is instruction. The agaw, Sparta's infamous educational system, is not built upon knowledge, but upon obedience, upon physical reaction, upon endurance, upon the body's submission before the mind can protest. Each morning begins before the sun has burned the dew from the grass. The air is sharp, dry, thick with dust and the scent of old leather. Sandals scuff against the earth as boys line up in silent rows, their shoulders raw from drills, their calves aching from holding positions too long. There are no greetings exchanged, no casual conversations. Words have no place here unless they are commands, or silence mistaken for discipline. A single error, a gaze dropped, a muscle trembling in fatigue, a pause before saluting, invites correction. The correction comes with skin, a slap, a punch, a swift kick behind the knee that sends the boy to the ground, where he must rise again without groan or hesitation. The body learns the rhythm of control, stimulus, pain, endurance, silence. The pednomoi, those adult men assigned to oversee the training of the boys, are chosen for their unwavering steadiness. They are not sadists, they do not beat in anger. Their blows are clinical, functional, a form of punctuation in the grammar of Spartan instruction. Each strike a lesson, each wound a sentence written in flesh, and they do not touch with affection. The hand that lands upon a shoulder does so only to correct posture. The hand that grips an arm does so only to adjust a stance. The hand that slaps a face does so without emotion, without apology. The boys come to expect it. They flinch less with time. Their skin toughens. Their reflexes sharpen. They begin to anticipate pain as part of learning, and worse still, they begin to crave its absence not as a return to peace, but as a sign of having finally done something right. Among themselves, the boys replicate the same structures. The older ones, those who have survived and adapted, are granted authority over the younger. These boys, barely past childhood, become enforcers, their eyes cold, their hands swift. They monitor everything, how a boy eats, how he walks, how he breathes during drills. And when a misstep occurs, they deliver the blow. The slap is faster, sharper, coming from someone nearly your own age. It is not paternal, it is a mirror. It reminds each boy of who he must become and what he must abandon to get there. There's no space in this system for softness, no pause between pain and instruction. No boundary between body and lesson. The training ground becomes a theater of silent suffering, a place where the floor is worn smooth by barefoot shuffling, where the sun reflects harshly off bare skin, glistening with sweat, where the cries of pain are swallowed before they rise, buried behind clenched teeth and bitten tongues. Even breathing is trained to be shallow and cold, deep under strain, and quiet always. Some boys are struck daily. Others learn to avoid the hand, not by hiding, but by becoming invisible. They adopt stillness, erase their movements. They fold themselves into the background, hoping that invisibility might offer mercy. But there is no mercy here. Only the constant gaze of discipline, only the expectation of perfection. And when perfection is not reached, which it never is, there is the hand, always the hand. And what remains in the heart of a child who is shaped not by guidance, but by repeated impact? What happens to the tender longing for approval when the only gesture he receives is pain? Over time, the longing dries up. What begins as confusion, "Why did he hit me?" becomes acceptance, then internalization. The boy begins to strike himself in his dreams. He corrects himself before the instructor speaks. He flinches before the hand lifts. The body becomes its own warden. And eventually, even that instinct dulls. The flinch disappears. The face goes blank. The eye no longer twitches. The spirit grows quiet. Because in Sparta, love was not the foundation of education. Correction was. And the only arms that reached out toward a child were those raised to discipline him, to strike him into silence, to slap him into manhood, to teach him above all that the body does not belong to the self, it belongs to the state. And the hand that shapes it is never soft. The Spartan sun was never gentle. It rose with a pale, merciless blaze, filling every corner of the sky with a dry, oppressive clarity. There were no clouds to soften its gaze, no shade deep enough to escape its reach. Its light fell like a weight upon bare skin, searing the air and baking the red soil until it cracked beneath bare feet. And in this unflinching brightness, they stood, boys of every size and shape, bodies uncovered, limbs exposed, the dust of morning clinging to ankles and knees, to the soft creases of youth, hardening under discipline. They were naked, not in fleeting moments of ritual, not in private spaces of comfort or cleansing, but daily, publicly, systematically. In Sparta, the body was not sacred. It was state property. Clothes were reserved for function, for adulthood, for the armor of battle. But here, in the agoj, boys were stripped not only of garments, but of concealment itself. There was nowhere to hide, not the shape of one's body, not the awkwardness of growth, not the quiet fear of being watched. To be naked was to be seen, fully, constantly. And everyone was watching. The instructors paced slowly, their eyes sharp, trained not only to assess posture and gait, but to examine symmetry, musculature, skin tone, a shoulder slightly sloped, a rib cage too visible, a calf not yet formed. Each flaw was noted, sometimes aloud, sometimes with a glance that said more than words. The boys learned quickly to scan themselves in their own minds, to anticipate criticism, to internalize the gaze of judgment. Their bodies became maps of failure and expectation. There were no mirrors, no moments alone. The act of dressing, of covering, of claiming a boundary between self and world was denied them. They moved through exercises, through meals, through rituals, bare to the wind, to the sun, to each other. The texture of nudity changed with the hour. In the morning, the air was crisp, and the skin bristled with cold, especially in the shade of the stone walls or under the breath of the mountain breeze. Goose flesh rippled across backs and thighs, and jaws clenched, not from fear but from chill, the boys forbidden to shiver. At midday, the heat became thick and oppressive. Sweat traced slow lines down their spines, pooled in the hollows beneath collarbones, salted their brows and upper lips. And at dusk, when drills ended, and the air turned golden with the fading sun, their bodies bore the marks of the day, scrapes from wrestling on gravel, red welts from punishment, streaks of dirt like ceremonial paint across ribs and shoulders. It was not erotic. It was not freeing. It was a method. To strip a boy of his clothing is to strip him of comfort, of modesty, of separation. To place his body under constant observation is to fuse him with the collective. He stops being an individual. He becomes part of a unit, uniform not in fabric, but in form, in posture, in silence. And what of those who did not fit the mold? The too thin, the too soft, the awkward. They learned to carry their shame like a second skin. They hardened faster, or broke sooner. There was no escape from the eyes of others, no curtain behind which to grow, to change, to heal. Every inch of their body became a lesson in conformity. Even rest brought no reprieve. At night they slept close, shoulder to shoulder, skin to skin, under thin woolen cloths that itched and never fully covered. The warmth of another body was never intimacy. It was necessity. And still the pressure to remain still, to remain silent, persisted. They were not allowed to touch in kindness. Not allowed to comfort. Nudity was exposure, not connection. And so their bodies learned to belong not to themselves, but to Sparta. And in this a strange pride took root. They became proud of their hardness, of their uniformity, of their ability to suffer exposure without flinching. They competed not only in speed or strength, but in the stoicism of their nakedness. The ability to stand unprotected beneath the sun, unashamed, unreadable. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of ritual and control, something trembled, a longing, a memory perhaps of softness, of being wrapped in cloth after birth, of being touched not to assess but to hold. But those memories faded slowly, until the only thing left was the sun and the dust, and the sense that the body was no longer a home. It was a weapon, sharpened by hunger, sculpted by pain, and bared before the world as proof. Because in Sparta, nudity was not natural. It was deliberate, it was discipline, it was exposure, carved into the soul. The night before, a Spartan battle was not filled with chants or speeches or roaring fires. There were no long preparations of weapons, no comforting rituals to ease the mind. There was only stillness and hunger. The young men sat in their own silence, separated even from each other, cloaked not in armor, but in absence. The moon above them was sharp and pale, casting shadows across their bare shoulders and lean backs. The earth beneath was cold, the stones pressing into their thighs, into the arches of their feet. They did not shift, they did not speak, they waited. This, too, was training. Before being sent to war, before crossing into the unknown of blood and loss, Spartan boys, now on the edge of manhood, were taught not how to kill, but how to disappear, how to hollow themselves out, how to let go of comfort and company, how to be hungry and remain still. Fasting was not a symbol, it was a practice. A preparation of the flesh. For 24 hours, sometimes longer, they were denied food, not as punishment, but as sharpening. Hunger was seen not as a weakness to be soothed, but as a teacher. It taught the body to function under strain. It taught the will to override instinct. It taught the soul to obey. The stomach twisted in on itself. At first, the boy would feel the emptiness as a gnawing ache, something to be resisted. But by nightfall, the pain flattened into something colder, less urgent. His limbs grew heavy, his thoughts slower, but more focused. The distraction of fullness vanished. All that remained was the breath, the stone, the darkness, and silence. That silence was deeper than the one they knew in the dormitories. It was not imposed by rules. It came from within, from the understanding that words would weaken the edge. That emotion could fray the tight stitching of resolve. That even the comfort of another's voice might become unbearable when the moment came to kill. And so they fasted and sat apart and thought, not of glory but of nothing, or tried to. Some boys closed their eyes, though they did not sleep. They listened to the soft rustle of wind through the dry grass, the distant cry of night birds, the occasional creak of armor being adjusted by older soldiers, their movements careful not to break the sacred quiet. There were those who welcomed the hunger, who felt themselves sharpened beneath it. Their eyes brightened in the dark, their hearts slowed, their focus narrowed. They felt closer to death, and so, paradoxically, more alive. Others trembled, internally, invisibly. They missed the weight of food in their belly, the warmth of another beside them, the simple rituals of water and voice and shelter. Their thoughts spun, then faded, The hunger turned to nausea, then to numbness. This was not failure. It was part of the forging. In the early morning, as the horizon began to pale with the coming light, the silence deepened further. No battle had yet begun, and yet, already, the war had started, inside them, between instinct and obedience, between need and command. They would rise not from rest, but from vacancy. Their movements would be slow, smooth, rehearsed. No one would speak. Their breath would come in shallow drags. They would march forward, not as individuals, but as a wall of flesh and discipline. And that hunger? It would not leave them, not during the march, not during the clash of iron on iron, not during the final cries of the dying. It would stay inside them like a second heart, a pulsing reminder that they had given up even the most basic human need to become something more, or something less. War for Sparta was not only about strength, it was about absence. Absence of fear, absence of softness, absence of food, absence of sound. And in that absence, they became what the polis demanded, but not without cost. Because every fast, every silent night before battle carved a little more humanity out of them, until one day the silence no longer felt like a test. It felt like home. The temple was not a place of quiet reverence. It echoed with noise, with chants, with breathless anticipation, with the soft rhythmic beat of drums that seemed to throb directly in the chest. And above all, with silence, not the silence of peace, but of tension. A silence stretched so tightly that it might tear at any moment, the kind of silence that precedes violence, the festival of Artemis Orthia. It was not a celebration in the way we understand it. It was a proving ground, a ritual forged in dust and blood and expectation, and at its center always were boys. Adolescent, stripped to the waist, their skin already marked from years of discipline, their eyes flat with determination or fear buried so deep it could no longer rise. They stood at the altar, not kneeling, not humbled, upright, braced, hands behind their backs or held tightly at their sides, feet planted in the dry soil, their breath shallow, measured, faces clenched into expressions of absence. Waiting. The lash was not ceremonial, it was real. Leather straps waited, sometimes tipped with bone or metal, designed not to discipline, but to break skin, to tear, to sting deep, to test. And then it began, one stroke. The sound louder than expected, a thick, wet snap followed by the echo of the crowd's withheld breath. Then another, and another. The rhythm built not like music, but like machinery, mechanical, relentless. The boy did not cry out. This was the expectation, not simply to endure pain, but to transcend it. To become something untouched by flesh. Screaming was not just discouraged, it was shameful. A public cry would disgrace not just the boy, but his family, his lineage, his city. So he remained still. Each strike landed with precision. Blood began to streak his back, first in thin lines, then in rivulets. The dust beneath his feet turned darker where it mixed with sweat, then with blood. His muscles twitched, but he did not fall. The crowd, composed of elders, peers, and mothers, watched without intervening. There was no protest, no pity, only the hard gaze of tradition, of expectation. Some faces were proud, others were unreadable. Some mothers bit the insides of their cheeks until they tasted iron. Their hands clenched into their tunics, but they said nothing. The whipping continued. It did not stop when the skin broke. It did not stop when blood ran freely. It stopped only when the body could no longer stand. Some boys collapsed in silence. Some died. And these were not seen as failures. On the contrary, they were honored, martyrs to discipline, to silence. their names inscribed not on gravestones, but in the collective memory of what it meant to be Spartan. And the boy who survived? He would carry the scars not with shame, but with pride. They would be a visible testament etched into his back, into his identity, proof that he had not screamed, that he had not wept, that he had become what Sparta required, not a person, but a vessel of endurance. What does it do to a soul to be rewarded for suffering in silence, to be celebrated not for triumph, but for not collapsing in agony? There is something haunting in the image of a child, still on the outside, shattered within, being lifted by others not in rescue, but in reverence. Something painful in a society that teaches that the highest honor is to be unmoved by pain. In Sparta, that pain was never private. It was public, it was sacred, and silence was its altar. In the low light of the Spartan dormitories, where oil lamps flickered with a blue-orange glow and long shadows stretched like fingers across the stone walls, a boy shifted slightly on his straw mat. The day had ended, but not completely. In Sparta, even night did not mean rest. It meant rehearsal, for stillness, for control, for vigilance. It meant silence. Yet, among the breathing bodies stretched across the room, there was something else, less visible, but equally structured, connection, uneven, unnamed, observed but never discussed. Each younger boy in the agog was watched, not only by his instructors, but by someone closer in age. An older youth, a few years ahead in training, taller, stronger, with shoulders already thickening from hours of labor and fasting in sun. This relationship, informal yet institutionalized, formed a complex part of Spartan education. The older boy was called the inspirer, the younger the beloved. But what passed between them was rarely simple and never entirely safe. It was not friendship in the sense we know it. It was not affection freely given, not kindness without strings. It was a bond wrapped tightly in hierarchy and ritual. It might begin with a glance during drills, a flicker of recognition, a calculation. The older boy would take notice of posture, of composure, of silence held well under pressure. If the younger seemed promising, he might be chosen. This choosing was not publicly announced. It happened in gestures. A command barked more often, a presence shadowing more closely. A mat moved near. Eventually a shared space, an expectation. And then the training deepened. The elder was tasked with instructing, correcting, watching. He would push the younger harder than others did, harder even than the paironomoi, because his own standing was tied to the discipline of the boy beneath him. If the novice faltered, the mentor was shamed. If he excelled, both rose in status. But within this rigid structure, something else emerged, moments of softness that defied the rules. A piece of bread quietly offered after a long day without food. A hand held briefly at night to steady a body trembling not from fear of drills, but from memories of home. A whisper in the dark, not of orders, but of something close to comfort. These moments were not spoken of. They existed in the space between punishments, in the eyes that looked away quickly when instructors passed, in the lips pressed tight, not to keep secrets, but to preserve something fragile. The lines were thin and often crossed. The nature of these relationships has puzzled historians for centuries. Were they pedagogical, emotional, erotic? In truth, they were all of these things and none. They were shaped by the expectations of the state, but also by the needs of boys forced to grow without touch, without parental presence, without softness. For many, the older boy became the only point of human warmth in a world of stone and noise and skin split by ritual. He was protector, punisher, model. He was feared and followed and, sometimes, quietly loved. But love was dangerous. Affection was monitored. Excessive tenderness was frowned upon, punished even. There were records of boys disciplined, not for disobedience, but for lingering too long at another's side, for placing a hand where it was not required, for showing concern that could not be translated into strength. The instructors did not fear sex. They feared sentiment, because sentiment unravels hierarchy. It makes equals out of roles meant to dominate and submit. It creates loyalty not to the state, but to a person, and that was an unacceptable risk. Still, the bonds endured. Older boys found pride in shaping those beneath them, not always cruelly. Some were fair, measured, even gentle, in secret. They taught not only how to strike, but how to stand, how to move quietly, how to hide pain, how to read a room, to feel a mood before it turned. Younger boys clung to those rare signs of care. A correction given without humiliation, a bruise treated with cloth soaked in cool water, not scorn. A story shared in the brief hours before sleep, half whispered, half sighed, about a mother's hands or the sound of birds from a hill beyond the Eurotas River. They were still boys, still made of nerves and dreams, of hearts that beat faster when looked at with approval, of minds that ached to be seen not as instruments, but as people. But Sparta did not have room for that. So the hierarchy remained, and as the years passed, the younger boys became older. They took on the roles of mentor, adopting the same measured tone, the same distant gaze. Some repeated the cruelties inflicted on them, believing this to be the path. Others softened slightly, offering their novices a shadow of the tenderness they once longed for. And in this way the cycle turned, a quiet choreography of domination and closeness, of control and need, of power masked as pedagogy, of longing wrapped in silence. In the dark, no one spoke of love, no one dared name it. But if you listened closely to the pause in a sentence, to the way one boy stood closer to another when no one watched, to the faint rustle of blankets adjusted for someone else's comfort, you might hear it, buried, wordless, enduring. The shield was heavy, not just in weight, though it bore the weight of solid wood, bronze plating, and years of sweat soaked into its leather grip, but in meaning. In Sparta, the shield was not simply a piece of armor. It was an identity, a boundary, a bond, a duty pressed into form. A boy first received his shield in adolescence, not a toy, not a practice prop, but a real full-sized hoplon, the same kind carried by men twice his age. It was circular, large enough to cover most of the body, and it smelled of oiled hide and bronze, a smell that would cling to him for years, buried into his skin and hair, as constant as his own breath. To hold the shield was to take up a role, not the role of a warrior, not yet, but of a protector, a part of the phalanx, a cell in a greater body. The shield was never about individual safety. It was too broad, too awkward. It was meant to defend the man to your left, while his shield defended you. In this way, the Spartan line held, not as a collection of fighters, but as a single organism. And so, from the moment a boy first bore its weight, he was taught, your shield is not yours. It belongs to the polis, to the line, to those who stand beside you in formation, breathing in time with your breath, bleeding beside your feet, falling when you falter. The consequences of dropping a shield in battle were not merely personal, they were collective. A space in the line was broken, a life, perhaps several, could be lost. The shame was not measured in bruises, but in the silence that would follow, the way elders turned their eyes away, the way your name was not spoken in the days that followed. Returning from battle without a shield was a disgrace greater than returning without an arm. Even mothers repeated the mantra to their sons as they left for war. With your shield or on it, never without it. The shield was the line between life and dishonor, between collective strength and personal collapse. To lose it was unthinkable, and so boys learned not only to carry it, but to become it. Their arms grew accustomed to its pressure, the strange soreness that bloomed in the shoulder after hours of standing at ready, the blisters that hardened into calluses where the leather strap dug into the forearm. They trained to run with it, to strike from behind it, to sleep beside it. Some spoke to their shields in whispers at night, prayers, confessions, quiet fears, wrapped in the one object they could not afford to drop. It became not just a tool, but a companion, a witness, and it was always watching. If a shield was lost during a skirmish, a retreat, or through panic, the punishment came swiftly, publicly. Sometimes it was a beating, sometimes exile, sometimes, worst of all, silence. The stripping away of the boy's place in formation, in routine and memory. He became a gap. The shame was carved not by words, but by absence. He was no longer permitted to stand with the others, no longer given commands. The shield had been his belonging, and now, without it, he belonged nowhere. This was more than military discipline. It was psychological. To fear losing the shield more than losing your life was to accept that your life belonged to others. That your body was a vessel, your breath part of a collective rhythm, your arms only as worthy as their grip on bronze and wood. It made the boy careful, obsessed. Every night he checked the shield's edge, ran his fingers along the metal, felt for chips, for wear, retied the grips, polished the boss in the center until it caught the dim firelight of the barracks. The shield slept beside him. It was the last thing he saw before sleep, the first weight he lifted each morning. And over time, the fear of dropping it became more than fear. It became identity. Because without the shield, who was he? Not a soldier, not a son, not a man, just a body, disconnected, alone. And in Sparta, there was no place for that. No room for bodies that moved outside the line. No space for lives that placed themselves above the wall of bronze and silence. The shield was more than protection. It was a vow. And to break that vow was to vanish, without memory, without name, without a place to stand. The boy held no stylus in his hand. There were no wax tablets waiting beside his mat, no rows of neatly shaped letters copied in silence under the careful gaze of a tutor. There was no ink on his fingertips, no parchment rolled into scrolls, no quiet room set aside for study. He had never learned to form the shape of his name, not with a pen, not even in dust. He could speak it. He could shout it in formation. He could die with it on his lips. But he could not write it. In Sparta, the written word was a foreign tongue, not banned, not feared, simply neglected. Its silence was deliberate. The agog, the long, brutal corridor from childhood to warriorhood, had no place for grammar, no tolerance for imagination. A boy's training involved the body, not the mind, and certainly not the mind's voice on paper. The alphabet existed, yes. Stone inscriptions dotted the city on temples, on shields, on public altars. Laws were carved into marble, names into memorials, orders into tablets too heavy for children to carry. But these were not for the boys, they were for the few, for the elders, the scribes, the machinery of the state. And even then, they were often read aloud, so the words lived only in air, not in the minds of those who heard them, not long after they vanished. The Spartan child did not learn to read because he was not meant to wander. The written word opened doors to questioning, to wonder, to contradiction. A sentence on a page could be studied, could be revisited, could be doubted. Sparta allowed no such luxury. A command once spoken was law, and a law once obeyed was never discussed. What need did a boy have for literature when his days were filled with drills and silence, with ritual and hunger. What need for poetry when the only rhythm he knew was the slap of sandals on dirt and the whisper of leather straps tightening against a wrist? What need for stories when his own was never his to tell? The agage taught memory, but not thought. Boys memorized rules, phrases, formations. They recited maxims, short, sharp sayings etched into their minds like scars. Endure. Obey. Do not ask. Their speech was clipped, their words economical. Long explanations were discouraged, curiosity punished. The walls around the mind were built early, and the written word was a chisel that could chip at those walls. Some learned to read, of course, the elite. A few who rose into command, who needed to read military communiques, who had to send orders beyond the city. But even they learned it late and with little reverence. Reading was not a pleasure, it was a utility. The boy who yearned to understand the symbols he glimpsed on a merchant's crate, who stared too long at the scratchings carved into temple stone, would be met with silence or a slap. Not from cruelty, but from order. That was not his path. That was not what the state required of him. The consequences were vast, though invisible. Without writing, the inner life was locked away. Thoughts remained unexamined, fleeting. Emotions, grief, confusion, longing, had no page to rest upon. The boy who lay awake at night, remembering his mother's voice or the warmth of home, had nowhere to set that memory down, no words to shape the ache. It passed through him like wind through branches, unrecorded, unshared. Sparta became a society of men who could strike but not reflect, who could obey but not express. And yet, in the silence, a different kind of memory formed, not written but embodied. Stories were passed in muscle, in repetition. Identity was carried in formation, in the exact way one moved, stood, endured. A Spartan did not write about who he was. He proved it, daily, until nothing else remained. But the cost was high. When war ended, when the shield was laid down, when the sandals were unstrapped and the days grew quiet, what voice remained? A soldier without literacy could not describe his pain, could not confess his nightmares, could not write to a child born while he was gone, could not speak to history in his own words, and so others wrote the story of Sparta, outsiders, enemies, observers from Athens, from Rome. They saw only the surface, the discipline, the silence, the scarred backs and still eyes. They called it noble, or cruel, or strange. But they could not read what the Spartans never wrote. And the boys? They disappeared into time, unnamed beyond their shields, their victories, their deaths. They did not leave behind letters folded in corners, journals under beds, ink-darkened scrolls passed from hand to hand. They left only footprints in red earth, only the shape of silence, because in Sparta the sword was taught to every hand. But the pen was never offered. They slept in huts of packed earth and woven straw, far from the stone barracks of the Spartans, far from the firelight of the agora. Their homes smelled of damp clay, of crushed herbs gathered from the hills, of smoke that lingered too long after the fire died out. The air was heavy, not just with the dust of fields worked from before dawn to nightfall, but with fear, a fear that did not scream, it pulsed. The Helots were the enslaved majority of Sparta, native peoples of Messenia and Laconia who had, generations earlier, been conquered and absorbed into the Spartan machine. They were not chattel in the way we often imagine slavery. They had families, homes, rituals, but they had no safety. Because at any moment they could be killed, not for rebellion, not for resistance, not even for disobedience, but for practice. Every year, as part of Sparta's brutal ritual of power, the ephors, Spartan magistrates, declared a symbolic war on the Helot population, a fiction maintained by tradition, a legal loophole that transformed murder into training. This ritual, called the krypteia, was entrusted to selected young Spartan men, boys on the cusp of adulthood, molded by silence and shaped by discipline, now sent into the countryside with daggers and hunger in their eyes. Their task was not combat, it was erasure. They moved at night, barefoot and cloaked in black, slipping through fields under the pale light of a thin moon. They did not speak. They carried no torches. They found the isolated helots, those considered clever, strong, vocal. The ones who stood too tall, who walked too proud, who might one day lead, and they killed them, swiftly, quietly, sometimes with a blade across the throat, sometimes with a strike to the skull, sometimes while they slept, curled beside a child beneath a blanket stitched by hand in a hut built by years of forced labor. No trial, no name spoken, no ritual, no farewell. The helot body was dragged into darkness, or left to be found, or simply vanished. For the young Spartan, this was a test of courage, of stealth, of obedience, of the ability to end a life without question. For the helot, it was a life under constant siege. There were no weapons to defend with, no system to appeal to, no protection in old age or innocence. A man could work the fields his entire life, plow through heat, harvest through pain, raise children with stories passed down from a time before conquest, and still, one night, feel the cold breath of his final moment as a dagger sliced through the curtain of his sleep. So they became watchers. Helots learned to listen to the silence. They slept in shifts. They kept dogs, quiet, lean, trained to sense movement in the fields. They taught their children not to speak too loudly at night. They never stayed long in one place. They looked into the eyes of young Spartan boys in the daylight and wondered, will this one be sent? The fear did not end with the krypteia. Even in times of peace, even in harvest season, the helots remained targets of casual cruelty. They were made to wear humiliating clothing, forced to get drunk for the amusement of Spartan youth, paraded as examples of what not to become. Their songs were mocked, their dances distorted, their labor harvested, but their dignity crushed. And yet they endured, not because they were resigned, but because they remembered. Their history lived not in stone temples or bronze statues, but in voice, in the way grandmothers whispered at night, in lullabies that lulled children to sleep not with promises of safety, but with stories of survival. In songs sung low while grinding grain, their rhythms outlasting generations of silence, and in rebellion. Yes, they rose. There were uprisings, bold and bloody, moments when the helots refused their role, when the quiet was broken by fire, when Spartan blood mingled with helot blood in the furrows of the very fields the enslaved had been forced to till. These moments were crushed, of course. Sparta responded with ferocity, with terror, with massacre. But the memory lingered. It was not only the helots who were shaped by this violence, it was the Spartans too. A society that lives in fear of the people it controls must constantly train itself to dominate. The agage, the silence, the hunger, the violence, it was all in part sustained to keep the helots down. The cruelty was cyclical, institutional. It demanded constant vigilance, constant rehearsals of power, but power like the soil remembers. And every step a Spartan boy took through the countryside, every whisper of grass beneath his feet, every hut passed in darkness, every eye that watched from behind a woven curtain was met with a truth his instructors would never teach, that behind every empire of discipline lies a sea of stolen breath, and those who sleep in fear remember longer than those who strike in silence. The wedding was held in silence, no procession through the streets. No flutes, no garlands, no dancing fires or public feasts. The bride did not wear bright colors. Her hair was not adorned with gold. In Sparta, marriage did not begin with celebration. It began with separation. A Spartan bride, just past puberty, waited in a darkened room. Her head was shaved, a symbolic stripping of femininity. Her clothing reduced to a simple cloak, not of beauty, but of uniformity. She sat still, her breath shallow. Outside, the noises of night blurred together, wind passing through pine trees, the slow crunch of steps over dry gravel. The groom arrived not in daylight, not with his family, but in secrecy. Often he was already a man trained in the agage, hardened, wordless, his body taut with restraint. He came alone. They would spend a few hushed moments together, perhaps a shared look, a brush of skin, a silence too fragile to fill. Then he left, back to the barracks. Back to the cold mats and the discipline of the phalanx. This was the beginning of Spartan married life, not in union, but in fracture. Husbands and wives lived apart, sometimes for years. Men slept with their comrades, ate with them, trained with them. The wife remained in her father's home, her new role suspended in limbo between girlhood and motherhood. The intimacy of marriage was reduced to brief stolen encounters. A husband might visit only at night, slipping into the house like a shadow, leaving before dawn. Not because love was forbidden, but because love threatened discipline. Regular affection softened resolve. Emotional connection was seen as a private loyalty that could rival the loyalty owed to the state. The boy who had learned never to cry, never to complain, never to ask for comfort, was now a man who could not stay beside the one person who might offer it. The policy was deliberate. It was believed that scarcity would inflame desire, that separation would intensify longing, forging stronger sons from lust, sharpened by denial, and above all, that the state would remain at the center of a man's world, not his wife, not his children, not even his home. Even after marriage, men spent most of their lives in communal military quarters. The bond between soldiers, between brothers in arms, was cultivated to be stronger than any romantic tie. The shared silence of the barracks, the rhythm of drills, the unity of formation, this was the Spartan hearth. And yet, in the quiet of those rare nights when husband and wife lay together, the distance between them spoke louder than their breath. Did they whisper? Did they pretend not to want more? Did the woman, hair still short, body still taut from the training expected of her sex, wonder what it would mean to live beside someone daily, to share warmth, not just bodies? The wife, too, was shaped by Sparta. Her duty was to produce sons, strong ones, boys who would not weep, boys who would train, boys who would never know the daily embrace of a father. She herself had been trained, fed well to grow tall, to bear children capable of enduring what she had endured in another form. And yet, when he left again, the house fell silent. She would wait weeks, sometimes months, for another visit. The child, once born, would not see its father often, not until it too entered the system of silence and strength. The family, as we imagine it, did not grow together. It fractured early, reshaped around the state's priorities. Even love had to serve Sparta. To hold someone too long was indulgent. To speak of dreams was weakness. To stay through the night was betrayal, not of the person beside you, but of the city that stood above all. So they kissed in silence, tangled limbs under shadows. He would rise while the stars still hung in the sky, and she would turn toward the wall, not because she did not care, but because she had learned not to show it. And when he walked out, bare feet brushing against the cold stone floor, the door closing softly behind him, Sparta remained, watching, always watching. The morning began before the sun touched the mountains. A Spartan woman stood alone in the courtyard, her breath already steady, her muscles already warm. Her tunic, short and unadorned, clung to her frame, not with softness, but with function. Around her, the training grounds were still damp with dew, the dirt cool beneath her bare feet. There were no mirrors, no idle conversations, only the quiet rustle of limbs preparing to move. In Sparta, the body of a woman was not an ornament, it was a battlefield. From the moment a girl could walk with confidence, she was conditioned to become something that no other Greek city expected of its daughters: powerful. Girls ran, wrestled, threw javelins, trained beneath the same sky as their brothers, often under the same shouting voices. They were fed well, meat, grains, milk. Unlike the malnourished daughters of Athens who learned to lower their eyes and speak only when asked, in Sparta, girls were taught to look forward, to speak clearly, to bear pain, but not for themselves. Every breath of strength they cultivated was not for autonomy, it was for maternity. The state watched their bodies as one might watch fields, evaluating, measuring, predicting yield. A Spartan woman's worth was bound tightly to her ability to bear sons who could endure the cruelty of the agage. Her hips were judged not for desire, but for delivery. Her endurance in training mirrored the endurance expected in labor, because to give birth in Sparta was to risk life in the service of the polis. The scrutiny was constant. Each year, girls were inspected, not unlike livestock. Their development was noted, their posture, their teeth, the clarity of their skin. A body that hinted at frailty was a body questioned, a limp, a chronic illness, a crooked spine. These could determine not just a girl's marriage, but her purpose. Only the strong were encouraged to breed, only the unyielding were honored. The state arranged their matches carefully, not for love, not even for politics, but for symmetry of flesh, for strength upon strength. Mating was eugenic, clinical, even ceremonial in its detachment. In rare cases, women were encouraged to conceive with other men if their husbands were deemed insufficient. Fidelity bowed to fertility, and once a child was born, the violence did not cease. A mother in Sparta did not weep. She did not rock her child to sleep with lullabies. She watched as strangers took him from her arms, examined his limbs, weighed him in silence. If he was judged unfit, she was not allowed to scream when he was taken. Her mourning would have been viewed as weakness. Her grief, a betrayal. The child was not hers. He belonged to Sparta, and so she returned home, her hands empty, her eyes dry, her back straight. Because Sparta needed straight backs, even in mothers, the daughters she raised were not spared the pressure. They were expected to mock boys who faltered, to sing songs that shamed the weak, to walk with the confidence of someone who might one day give birth to kings. Even their humor was honed into discipline, even their joy was monitored. But there were cracks. Behind closed doors, beneath the hard skin of public duty, women whispered. They remembered. They grieved quietly. Some would trace the outlines of children lost on the palms of their hands at night. Others would repeat the names of sons who had died in training, their voices so low even the wind could barely carry them. They were strong, but strength had its weight. And even in Sparta, under the veneer of control and pride and purpose, a woman could feel her ribs ache from holding in all the things she could never say. The pressure did not lift as she aged. An older woman who had borne many sons whose children had died without screaming was revered. She walked with head high, was granted public voice, even influence. But those who bore none, or whose children failed the city, were reduced, quieted. Their silence was not pride, but punishment. And yet, these women held Sparta together. They bore the next generation. They trained them in silence. They buried them without song. They endured not for themselves, but for a city that demanded their wombs, their strength, their stillness. And in the spaces where no man listened, they told stories to one another, not of heroism, but of endurance, of pain that did not need to be noble to be real. Because in Sparta, the strongest were often those who never lifted a shield, but who lifted children and let them go. The boy stood in the center of the courtyard, a gust of dry wind tugging at the hem of his tunic, his cheeks burning, not from heat, but from exposure. Around him, the others watched, not with cruelty in their eyes, but with the cool, blank expression of those who had learned not to flinch, not to feel. He had failed. Perhaps his grip on the spear had faltered, perhaps he had stumbled in formation, or perhaps his voice had cracked when shouting an order. It did not matter what the mistake had been. In Sparta, error was not merely a personal flaw, it was a disturbance to the whole, and it had to be cleansed, not with correction, but with humiliation. Laughter followed, not spontaneous, not light-hearted, but disciplined, calibrated, the way one might laugh at a trained cue. The instructors said nothing. They had taught this lesson long ago. The body learns through pain, and the soul through shame. Public ridicule was not an exception in the agog. It was a method. The Spartans understood something that many societies only discovered centuries later, that ridicule wounds deeper than discipline. A slap bruises the flesh. A laugh, when directed at one's weakness, bruises the identity. The boy did not cry. He did not lower his eyes. That, too, would be punished. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his jaw tight, his breathing controlled, his gaze fixed ahead. He had learned to become the statue of himself, to show no fissure, even when the crack had already run down the spine of his confidence. The others would talk of it later, quietly, the way his foot slipped, the way his voice broke, a warning, a reference, a cautionary tale told with the dull edge of familiarity. Because each had been there, or would be. Shame, in Sparta, was a tool of governance, not reserved for the young or the weak or the disobedient, but woven into the daily rhythm of life. Boys were mocked for hesitation, for softness, for forgetfulness. Adults, too, could be shamed at public meals, in assemblies, during festivals. One did not escape it with age. One simply became better at concealing the bruise. For Spartans, shame was both boundary and map. It told you where not to tread. It reminded you of the cost of stepping out of rhythm. Instructors did not explain why the ridicule hurt. That was not their task. They only ensured it happened. The community would handle the rest. Boys learned quickly to monitor their posture, their words, even their expressions. A twitch of the mouth could betray uncertainty. A moment of hesitation could draw laughter sharper than any blade. And what of compassion? What if one boy reached out to help, to defend, to comfort? That too was mocked. To side with the shamed was to absorb some of their disgrace. Pity was a danger, a virus that weakened the immune system of the collective. A boy who offered his hand might later find his own fingers slapped in front of the group, his gesture retold as a joke. So they stood apart, each watching the fall of the other, learning the choreography of detachment. And over time, the boy began to hear the laugh before it happened, anticipate it. He would feel its approach like thunder rolling in the chest. A word mispronounced, a movement out of sync, even a glance too full of longing. And with each failure, real or perceived, he adjusted, spoke less, moved less, felt less. This was the goal, a body that did not flinch, a mind that did not wonder, a heart that did not bruise, because it had become too hardened or too hidden to feel the impact of ridicule. But in the quiet, when the training ended and the firelight flickered across the dormitory walls, the shame lived on. It sat beneath the skin like a second heartbeat, unspoken, unaddressed, remembered. It would shape the way he walked as a man, the way he loved or did not love, the way he responded to weakness in others, with silence or sarcasm or scorn. Not because he had chosen that path, but because he had been forged in it. Sparta did not build its warriors through strength alone. It built them through shame, layered, unrelenting, invisible. And the boy in the courtyard? He would return the next day. He would not repeat his mistake. But the echo of that laughter would follow him. Everywhere. The house was built of stone, low to the ground, its walls cool even under the noon sun. Inside, the air was still. Dust hung in the golden shafts of light that slipped past the shutters. A clay bowl rested on a wooden table, half filled with water. Somewhere in the distance, a cicada sang its thin, metallic note. But within the home, there were no voices. A Spartan home was not a place of laughter. It was not a space for long conversations or tender questions. Here, silence was not emptiness. It was instruction. From childhood, Spartan boys and girls were taught that restraint in speech was a virtue, laconic, the world would later call it, a word born from Laconia itself, the region of Sparta. It meant brief, minimal, exact. But behind this admired conciseness was something heavier, a culture of suppression, where the unspoken was safer than the spoken, where every word was a potential liability. In the barracks, boys were trained to answer with as few words as possible. To express uncertainty was weakness. To elaborate was vanity. They learned to compress their thoughts into stone-shaped phrases, sharp, unyielding, often cryptic. The ideal was to speak with impact, not with intimacy. Silence, after all, could not be mocked. Silence could not be misinterpreted. Silence could not be punished. This training followed them into their homes, if and when they returned. Imagine the household of a Spartan warrior. The hearth flickers with low flame. A mother, aged but upright, prepares the evening meal. A wife, strong in stature, tight-lipped, moves with measured efficiency. A son, barely 10, sits on the floor polishing the bronze of a small blade. No one speaks unless necessary. No one asks about feelings. There are no stories about the day, no idle chatter to fill the air. Even love, when it appears, must do so silently. A father might rest a hand on a child's head, not with tenderness, but with gravity. A mother might adjust her daughter's posture, not out of affection, but obligation. Affection expressed too freely risked breeding softness, sentimentality, disobedience. In this silence, something ancient lived. The belief that words have weight and should not be wasted, that to speak too much is to expose oneself, to doubt, to error, to weakness. A well-timed silence was not absence, it was armor, a shield against vulnerability. And yet within these stone homes, unspoken truths gathered like smoke. The grief of a mother whose son did not return from training, the questions of a girl who saw blood for the first time and received no explanation. The shame of a man who had stumbled in combat, who had been laughed at behind closed doors and who now sat at dinner without appetite. They did not talk about these things. They looked at their bowls. They chewed slowly. They drank water as if it were ritual. In families, the damage could be invisible. Children grew up without knowing what softness looked like, what open emotion sounded like. They learned that uncertainty should be swallowed, that joy should be quiet. That sadness had no language. When boys returned home from the agoj on rare occasions, their speech had already narrowed into the Spartan ideal. If asked how they were, they might answer with a nod or a short phrase, "I endure." A mother might want to ask more, but she wouldn't. Not because she didn't care, but because to pry was to open a wound that Sparta insisted must remain closed. Even between spouses, language was often a negotiation of limits. A wife might speak of practical matters, grain stores, livestock, children. But if she asked her husband about the things he had seen, the men he had killed, the boy who died during training, she would receive nothing. A look, perhaps, a tightening of the jaw, and then silence. It was not cruelty, it was training. In Sparta, discipline was not just in the body, it lived in the tongue and in the home. This meant a daily performance of restraint. To speak was to risk. To remain silent was to preserve the image of strength, control, unity, but beneath the surface, words pressed against the walls of the mind. Children who were never asked how they felt grew into adults who did not know. Spouses who never shared softness learned to love only through ritual. Parents who never spoke of grief buried it deeper, year after year, until it reshaped the way they stood, breathed, moved. And sometimes, in the rarest moments, perhaps on a winter night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, someone would break the pattern. A whisper, a confession, a question, quickly silenced, but remembered. Because even in Sparta, the soul longed to be heard. Even in a home built on stone and silence, someone at some moment wanted to say, "I am afraid," or "I miss him," or "Do you remember when we laughed?" But the words never came, and so the silence remained. A kind of inheritance, passed down, generation by generation, not in scrolls or letters, but in glances, in withheld breaths, in all the things never said. Night in Sparta was not a time for rest. Even after the fires dimmed and the city's pulse slowed to a low murmur beneath the stars, there were those whose eyes refused to close, not because they were restless, but because they had been taught that rest was not something to seek. It was something to overcome. In the agage, the brutal educational system that forged Spartan boys into warriors, sleep was not a sanctuary. It was a test, a threat, a temptation to be resisted, observed, distrusted. Sleep was softness. Sleep was surrender. So they trained themselves to stay awake. The dormitory was cold, its stone floor scattered with woven mats, barely thicker than a folded cloak. The air smelled of old sweat and wool and dust. Dozens of boys lay side by side, their breathing shallow, synchronized, nearly silent. Their eyes closed, perhaps, but not all of them slept. One boy, 10, maybe 11, lay flat on his back, staring up at the thatched ceiling above. His body ached, not from a single injury, but from 100 small ones layered upon each other. Bruises from training, welts from punishment, muscle strain from endless drills. But still, he fought the drift of sleep, because sleep was vulnerability. If a trainer passed in the night and found him too deep in rest, there could be punishment, a cold bucket of water, a sudden slap, worse, ridicule, laughter from the others. Not because they found it funny, but because they had learned to survive through it. So the boy trained himself in microsleeps, in blinking longer than usual, in dozing without fully surrendering. Some boys learned to sleep sitting upright. Others stayed alert by clenching a muscle rhythmically through the night, so the body remained just awake enough to prevent deep rest. They spoke sometimes in whispers too low to carry beyond a few inches. Did you sleep? No. Me neither. But they had, briefly, in fragments, enough to survive, not enough to dream. Dreaming was dangerous anyway. It softened the mind, it invited emotion, memory, fear. Instructors encouraged vigilance. They praised boys who could remain standing after a day without rest. They idolized those who pushed past fatigue until their bodies trembled. Endurance was the measure of worth, not only on the field, but in the bed. Spartan boys learned to wear exhaustion like armor, to carry it silently, and when it cracked, when a boy collapsed during a march or faltered during a drill, the others were told not to help, not to pity, not to notice. The boy would be dragged aside, berated, punished with extra exercise, isolation, or worse, shame. This practice seeped into adulthood. Spartan men, even after the agaugi, rarely allowed themselves true rest. War demanded wakefulness, so did duty, so did pride. Many learned to sleep in armor, to nap upright on guard, to wake instantly at the softest sound, a twig underfoot, the shift of leather, the change in wind. Veterans of Sparta often aged before their time, their eyes dulled. Not from peace or boredom, but from years of sleep cut short. They blinked slower. They forgot small things. They lost color in their skin. They spoke less, not out of wisdom, but because the brain, deprived of deep rest, had learned to function on survival alone. The state did not mourn this. It celebrated it. To be praised for functioning despite exhaustion was a mark of greatness. To fall asleep too easily was suspect, a sign of indiscipline, indulgence, civil softness. And yet, the human body, any body, carries its own memory of sleep. And in the quietest hours of night, when no trainers were near, and the stars were still, and the air cool and kind, there were boys who surrendered, who allowed themselves just once to exhale fully, to let their fingers unfurl, to close their eyes without fear. And in that moment, brief, fragile, luminous, they did not think of Sparta. They did not think of drills or scars or voices barking orders. They dreamed of something unspoken. And in that dream, however fleeting, was a world without war, without shame, without watchers, just silence and sleep. In Sparta, beauty was not softness. It was not the curve of a shoulder admired in sunlight or the color of hair braided for ritual. It was not found in adornment or gentle movement or a face free from scars. In Sparta, beauty was pain made visible. It was the symmetry of wounds, the posture of endurance, the elegance of a body disciplined by hardship. The Spartan aesthetic was sculpted not in marble, but in flesh, real flesh, bruised, calloused, bloodied. Boys emerged from training not with smiles, but with silence and scars. A welt along the back was not something to hide. It was proof that you had been struck, that you had not cried, that your skin, like your will, had held firm. There was pride in disfigurement, not the grotesque twisting of limbs, but the small marks that showed submission to the city's demands. A twisted finger permanently bent from catching a shield wrong, a ridge across the shin where a wooden staff had connected during training, a missing tooth, a sunken eye, all signs that you had survived the ritual and in surviving had become worthy. Pain was not hidden, it was displayed. In the gymnasium, boys trained naked under the fierce sun. Sweat poured down backs lined with healing cuts, blood mixed with dirt. Muscles trembled, not just from strain, but from punishment endured without protest. Their bodies became maps of violence, of resistance, of belonging, and others looked on, instructors, peers, elders. They did not flinch. Instead, they admired. There was a wordless approval in the way an elder might rest his eyes on a boy who stood, bleeding from the lip, unmoved. In the way a younger trainee would glance at an older one's limp and think, I want that limp. Not because of the pain it represented, but because of the honor behind it. Honor lived in discomfort, to walk without wincing, to kneel on torn knees without shifting, to bear infection in silence. These were acts of beauty. To grit the teeth so tightly that the jaw trembled but no sound escaped, that was poetry. Not written in verse, but in breath held through agony. And women, too, were raised with this gaze. Spartan girls trained beside boys. They, too, learned to fall hard and rise without assistance. Their bodies were expected to be firm, unyielding, not decorative, functional, admired not for fragility, but for power. Even in relationships, beauty was shaped by discipline. A young man's scars were not unattractive. They were proof of passage. A woman's muscle, her speed in foot races, the clarity of her shout, these were traits that drew admiration. Desire was bound to resilience, attraction bound to sacrifice. But pain, idealized, became invisible. When every wound is a medal, who tends the hurt? No one asked if the boy wanted to be struck. No one wondered whether he dreamed of gentleness. No one stopped to say, "This must be too much." Because in a society where suffering is praised, to question pain is to question identity. And in Sparta, identity was forged in endurance. There were stories of boys who hid injuries to avoid appearing weak. One had a festering wound beneath his arm. Flies circled it, and yet he trained. Another, bitten by a snake, refused to speak of it. He limped, trained, and collapsed. Not as a tragedy, but as a model. The pain itself was not the focus. It was the stillness within it, the way a Spartan learned not just to feel pain, but to contain it, shape it, present it. Even in festivals, pain was ritualized. Boys were whipped before crowds. The skin opened, the muscles spasmed, the crowd watched, not with horror, but reverence. This was not cruelty. This was spectacle. This was art. Suffering, properly managed, was public performance. But behind closed doors, what did the body remember? When the lights dimmed, when the audience dispersed, when the bandages were removed and the breath released, what remained? The ache, the limp, the loss of movement, and in older age, the price. Spartan veterans carried pain with them, embedded deep in the joints, in the spine, in the hips. Not from a single injury, but from years of silent, invisible harm. They did not complain. They sat in the sun longer, moved slower. They did not speak of it. They had learned that beauty does not confess. But sometimes at night, when they lay down and the house was still, one hand might touch a scar absent-mindedly. Trace it, remember it, and feel perhaps not pride, but something quieter. Something wordless, not regret, not grief, but the memory of a time when pain was everything, and when to feel nothing at all was the highest form of glory. The sound of laughter in Sparta was rare. It was not forbidden by law nor punished by lash, but it was discouraged gently, persistently, thoroughly, until it vanished almost entirely from the daily rhythm of life. The streets, though alive with the movement of warriors and the footsteps of children in training, echoed with silence or commands, not with joy. In Sparta, to laugh openly was to forget oneself, to lose control, and control was everything. Boys in the Agos quickly learned to silence their amusement. A joke that might have brought howls in other cities, boisterous Athens, for example, was met with tight lips and narrowed eyes in Sparta. Laughter made the body soft. It disrupted posture, muddled breath, unraveled composure. It created bonds of spontaneity between people, and in a system where every bond had to be filtered through hierarchy, rank, and purpose, such looseness was a threat. Even as small children, Spartans learned this lesson in subtle ways. A boy who laughed too easily during drills might find himself tasked with extra labor, not because of the sound itself, but because of what it revealed: excess emotion, distraction. The dangerous bloom of individuality in a garden that demanded uniformity. Instructors rarely raised their voices. They didn't need to. One look was enough to press a boy back into line, and the boys, in turn, learned to laugh inwardly, if at all. To tuck their amusement into the deepest folds of the self, where it could not betray them, even in leisure, if it can be called that, Spartans maintained restraint. The communal meals were not filled with wine-fueled stories. They were measured. Conversations clipped, faces calm. Perhaps a quiet smile might pass between two men recalling a shared memory, but the kind of laughter that shook the shoulders, that left the lungs gasping, was absent, because it made one vulnerable. And in Sparta, vulnerability was never admired. The emotional control demanded in battle began in boyhood. A soldier must not laugh, just as he must not cry. Both were signs of release, and release was weakness. To laugh at pain, at a fallen comrade, even at oneself, that was one thing. That could be cold, sharp, hardened. But warm laughter, affectionate laughter, the kind that comes from safety and affection, that had no place in the phalanx, no place in the home, no place in the heart of a Spartan. Girls, too, were taught the same. They trained their bodies, mocked the weak, shouted songs that praised strength, but they did not gather to giggle or play or dream aloud. They were being molded into mothers of warriors. Their voices were strong, their faces serious. A girl who laughed too often might be told she lacked discipline. She would be reminded that her womb must one day produce boys who would die silently, and what kind of mother would prepare them if she could not hold her own stillness? And so laughter faded. Not entirely, it still lived in secret places. In moments of night, when a boy lay beside a friend and whispered something forbidden. In the privacy of a glance between siblings, in the silence after training, when exhaustion made everything strangely funny for a moment. But even then, it was cut short, stifled. The body remembered not to shake, the breath not to rise, the mouth not to open wide. Spartans feared that laughter opened the door to softness, to nostalgia, to compassion. And in a city designed to suppress those instincts in favor of discipline, it could not be allowed to flourish. Yet, what happens to a society that does not laugh? What becomes of men and women who never allow joy to rise to the surface? Perhaps they grow stronger, perhaps they grow stiller, but perhaps too they grow distant from each other, from themselves, from the parts of their humanity that seek not glory or control, but release. Because laughter is not just noise, it is a moment when the body lets go, when breath expands, when emotion crests and spills, and in Sparta, such moments were dangerous. So they did not laugh, not because they lacked humor, but because they feared what joy might undo. The courtyard was quiet, not from absence, but from design. The news had arrived that morning. A son had fallen, young, swift, obedient. He had died without a sound during the Platonistas, his body failing mid-blow. He had not cried out. He had not hesitated. His eyes were open when they carried him away. And now his mother stood beside the central hearth, her back straight, her mouth sealed. She did not weep, because in Sparta, grief had rules. A Spartan mother was expected to feel sorrow, but silently, invisibly. To cry in public, to fall to the ground, to tear her hair, these were not just signs of mourning, they were signs of weakness. Signs that the city had not done its job in shaping her, signs that her son had been loved too much as an individual, not enough as a soldier. In Sparta, the body of a warrior was not his own, not in life and certainly not in death. From the moment a boy was born and passed the inspection that spared him from Tagetus, he belonged to the polis. Every hour of his training, every bruise on his skin, every meal he shared with his comrades rather than his family, these were payments towards that ultimate debt. To die well, to die usefully, to die silently. And if he did, if he died without fear or failure, then no tears were permitted, because to mourn him would be to doubt the honor of his passing. To mourn him would be to center the personal over the political, to suggest that his absence was a loss rather than a fulfillment. So the rituals were subdued. No procession, no lamentation, no long speeches of what could have been. His name might be carved in wood, his shield passed to a younger boy, a mark made on a wall, but his mother would wear no black. His siblings would not whisper his stories. His father might speak his name only once, quietly to the elders, and then silence. Some women tried, in the privacy of a field, in the dark corners of a stable, bent over a basket of grain, pretending to cough, pretending to stumble. Their hands would press against their chest. A sob would build, tremble, reach the edge of the throat, and stop, because they knew someone was listening. Neighbors, perhaps, another mother, a child being groomed for the same fate. They could not afford the luxury of mourning, not if they wanted to remain respected. Not if they wanted to raise more sons. The only public display permitted was pride. A mother could stand taller, could speak of her son's last breath with precision, could say, "He died without sound." And others would nod, not touch her shoulder, not embrace her, not say they were sorry, but nod. And the nod was supposed to be enough. But inside, grief did not nod. Grief bloomed in the hollows of the chest, in the way the breath caught walking past a training field, in the scent of wool that once clung to his tunic, in the emptiness of the sleeping mat that would never again be folded. Grief was clever. It learned to disguise itself as memory, as silence, as posture. There were mothers who aged overnight, who walked more slowly, who forgot names, who grew brittle not from age, but from a decade of tears, never cried. Even boys learned. If their comrade died, they were told to look forward, to shout louder the next day, to fill the gap in the line without hesitation. But they remembered the way he laughed, even when he shouldn't, the way he moved his hands when nervous, the way his eyes searched the crowd before training. And they too did not cry, not even in the dark, not even when no one was near, because they knew that one day their own death must also be met without tears. That was the deal Sparta made, to live without softness, to die without mourning. To grieve in silence so perfect, it seemed like strength. The battlefield was not always distant. Sometimes it began in the mind. Sometimes it was a test set by the elders, disguised as an accident, to see if a boy would bend, not just his body, but his judgment, his instinct, his soul. The ground was dry, hard-packed earth with the scent of iron in the air, not blood, not yet, but the memory of it, held in the dust from drills past. Boys lined up in tight formation, barefoot, breath shallow, eyes forward. Their spears were wooden, dulled with use, but still dangerous. Sweat shone on young skin, not yet men, not quite children. And then someone fell. It happened during the maneuver. A foot caught on a stone. A boy staggered, dropped his stance, twisted his ankle. He groaned, not loud, but enough. His leg buckled. He went down. There was silence. And then the lesson began. One boy hesitated, looked down. Saw the twisted limb, the grimace, the pale lips trying to form a plea. For just a second he shifted his weight, his hand twitching toward the fallen figure. "Help him," said something ancient in him, something older than Sparta, older than training, older than obedience. But the others were still, their shadows unmoving in the sun, and then came the voice, dry, distant, authoritative. "Do not touch him." The boy froze, and he understood. This was not about pain, not about injury. This was a test of ideology, a filter, the moment when the state whispered, "We will not raise heroes who hesitate." To help a fallen comrade was, in Sparta, a kind of treason, not against the boy himself, but against the idea of Sparta. Because mercy was dangerous. It clouded judgment. It interrupted formation. It made one man care about another's suffering more than the cohesion of the whole. And the whole, that sacred unity of the phalanx, was everything. They were taught that a man who broke rank to carry a wounded brother was as dangerous as the enemy's blade, that a soldier who hesitated in order to show compassion might cause the entire line to collapse, that one life was not more important than order. And so they turned away. The injured boy was dragged off later, not by friends, but by instructors. No ceremony, no comfort. His leg was splinted in silence. His name was not praised for courage. It was whispered later as a caution. But what of the one who tried to help? He was punished, not physically perhaps, not immediately. But his name was marked, his record tainted. He might find himself cleaning the barracks alone, running extra laps, paired with crueler boys during drills. And always, that word, that damning word, weak. Not because he lacked strength, but because he had shown mercy. And mercy in Sparta was weakness disguised as nobility. It wasn't only boys. There are records, fragmentary, incomplete, of soldiers in battle who were seen pulling wounded comrades off the field. They did not return to praise. They returned to silence or worse, to suspicion. Had they been too attached? Had they prioritized feeling over function? A soldier once refused to leave the body of his brother behind. He carried him for miles, bleeding, dead, or nearly dead. When he returned, he was not welcomed. He was questioned. He had broken rhythm. He had acted on love. And Sparta feared love almost as much as it feared defeat, because love pulls. It tugs at the bonds of the state. It makes one boy value another not as a unit, not as a shield bearer, but as a person, with pain, with history, with meaning. And in a system built on discipline, emotion is noise, so they trained it out. They taught that to ignore suffering was strength, that to suppress the instinct to aid was wisdom, that to let someone die, not with malice but with discipline, was honor. And yet, there were those who remembered. Years later, in the quiet corners of old age, warriors sat near the fire, no longer watched, no longer feared, their eyes dimmed but clear. And when they spoke, rarely gently, they sometimes named those they didn't save, a friend, a brother, a boy who fell. They said the name not with regret, not exactly, but with something else. A silence that lingered after the words, heavy as stone. Because even in Sparta, mercy could not be unlearned entirely. It remained, hidden, waiting. A quiet ache that no punishment could fully erase. In Sparta, war was not an event. It was a calling, a rhythm, a faith. The city did not prepare for battle as an interruption of life. It molded every hour of existence in anticipation of it. From the first breath of a boy deemed strong enough to survive infancy to the last exhale of a veteran scarred in silence, Sparta breathed war like oxygen. It was not merely necessary, it was sacred. This sanctification began early, not only through the agage, but through myth, ritual, and the very stones of the city. Ares was not an admired god in most of Greece. In Athens, he was treated with caution, even disdain. His thirst for blood, his unpredictability, his coldness were seen as dangerous, uncontrollable. But in Sparta, Ares was not feared, he was honored. He had a temple, a rare thing in the Greek world. There, in the dry quiet of the sanctuary, Spartan youth were reminded that to serve in war was not a matter of survival or even victory. It was identity. War was not merely politics with swords, it was the stage upon which their worth was tested. The rituals confirmed it. Before battle, there were sacrifices, sometimes animals, sometimes symbolic offerings. Blood was poured, incantations spoken in hoarse tones. Warriors stood still, half shadowed by torchlight, as priests invoked the favor of Ares and Artemis, twin spirits of precision and fury. There was no plea for safety, only permission to kill, only affirmation that their lives belonged to the state. and that their deaths, if needed, would sanctify the soil they bled upon. Boys watched these rituals before they were old enough to fight. They stood behind the columns, still small, still thin, eyes wide, absorbing the silence, the weight of it. They learned that the body was not only to be trained, but offered, that their veins were threads in a larger tapestry, the will of Sparta, the hunger of the gods. Peace, in contrast, was treated with suspicion. It was not a time of celebration. It was a pause, an interruption, something unnatural. Men who had not fought were lesser. Boys who had not bled were incomplete. Periods without conflict were not filled with joy, but with readiness, impatience, rituals of memory that kept the edge sharp. Even the songs of Sparta were warlike, chants that praised the shield, not the lyre. Songs sung in time with marching feet, not gentle dances. Mothers taught their children not lullabies, but fragments of ancient verse. Return with your shield, or on it, not poetry of love, but of legacy and death. And when the time came and the horn sounded, it was not panic that stirred in the hearts of warriors. It was peace, because for them, peace was found only in the precise moment when spear met flesh, when the body forgot sleep and pain and hunger, and became motion. When a man knew, without doubt, that his purpose was being fulfilled, the battlefield was sacred ground, not for the horror, but for the purity, the clarity that came with certainty. In war there were no questions, only movement, only discipline, only the execution of all that had been rehearsed. In the aftermath, there was no mourning, not allowed. Men returned not as heroes in parades, but as continuations of the city's will. Blood-stained tunics were washed in silence. Broken limbs were set without ceremony. Lost companions were noted, their names whispered only once. And when a man could no longer fight, something inside him dimmed. Some limped through the agora with eyes that no longer scanned for danger. Some sat in the sun too long, speaking less and less. They were not dishonored, but they were no longer essential. Because to live in Sparta without war was to wait for another call, wait to be useful again, wait for death. And so, even in peace, Sparta trained, marched, drilled, prayed for war not as tragedy, but as return to meaning, to motion, to silence sharpened into action. And through it all, Ares watched. Not from the heights of Olympus, but from the hearts of every man who had learned that to love battle was not madness, but devotion. A devotion etched into their bones, one that did not crave peace, but the sacred wound of war. He came home walking slowly. His steps were precise, calculated, not because he was cautious, but because his body had been trained to move that way. Even now, years after his last campaign, his gait was still that of a soldier. He did not swing his arms. He did not shuffle. He advanced, as he had always been taught, as if someone were watching, but no one was. The agora, bathed in the amber light of a late Spartan afternoon, was nearly empty. The sounds were soft, distant sandals against stone, the occasional low murmur of traders, the rhythmic clinking of a smith's hammer somewhere out of sight. There were no drums, no music, no cheers. Because in Sparta, men did not return from war to fanfare. They returned to discipline, to silence, to the invisible crown of survival. But what the city called glory, he carried like a stone, lodged deep in his chest. The war had ended weeks before, not a great war, not a tale that would echo through generations. A brief campaign, a border dispute, blood spilled on dry ground, and then a return. Some did not come back, others did, walking, limping, carried. He had come back whole. That, they told him, was a gift, a badge. He was expected to be proud, but he felt none of it. because he had seen the eyes of the boy who died beside him, eyes wide with shock, not fear, not yet, eyes that searched for meaning as the blood poured too fast to be stopped. The boy's hand had reached for his just briefly, just once, and he had hesitated, not because he did not care, but because he had been trained not to. You do not touch the dying. You do not mourn in the moment. You do not break formation. He had followed that rule. The boy died alone. Now he woke in the middle of the night gasping, not with screams. He had trained those out, but with silence so thick it felt like drowning. He saw the eyes again, heard the quiet of the field, felt the weight of the shield he could not drop, the press of armor against ribs too tight with grief. In the day, he did what was expected. He cleaned his spear, though it would not be used again for months. He trained with boys too young to understand death. He stood in the sun, his face unreadable, his limbs steady. But inside, something moved, restless, shifting, wordless, because Sparta had not given him the tools to be a survivor, only to be a weapon. And when the war ended, the weapon was supposed to rest, to be honored. But what do you do with a sword when it is no longer needed? You store it away. You forget its edge. You let it rust. That was what he feared, not death, oblivion, that he would fade slowly into a figure without purpose. Others felt it too. Old comrades passed him in the streets with blank nods. Their eyes were dull, unfocused. Some drank more than they used to, alone, their mouths tight, their laughter stiff. Some stopped talking altogether, not in protest, in resignation, because what was there to say? That war had taken something, that the silence at night was heavier than any armor, that they had done what was required and returned and found nothing waiting. Their families were proud, but distant. Wives who had waited years did not know how to hold a man shaped by so much absence. Children were afraid of his quiet, his stillness, his unpredictability. He could not tell them what haunted him, because to speak of it would be to name it. And Sparta did not name pain. It revered sacrifice, but only the kind that ended in death. Those who lived had to carry themselves as monuments, unmoving, unbroken. But he was breaking. Every night, in the privacy of sleep, he broke. And every morning he reassembled, because that too was what he had been trained to do, to bind his wounds with discipline, to stack his memories like shields, to bury the grief so deeply that even he no longer remembered where it lived. And yet it lived. In the way he flinched at laughter, in the way he sat with his back to a wall, in the way he touched the scar on his thigh during long silences, as if reminding himself he was still here. Glory had been promised. He had found it. But it did not shine. It pressed against his chest like a weight, heavy, cold, and utterly invisible. In Sparta, there was no word for sorrow in survival, no ceremony for those who returned whole in body but fragmented in spirit. And so he walked each day through the same dust-covered streets, his shadow long, his silence longer, glorious, respected, and unbearably alone. His name is not recorded in marble. There is no statue, no fragment of verse. Not even a whisper in the official chronicles of Sparta, which, as expected, rarely chronicled failure, especially not the failure of their sacred system. But among a few scattered oral accounts told quietly by helots preserved in the dusk between generations, there is a story, a boy, a name perhaps lost or changed to protect him, but a life that did not end on a training field or on a battlefield or in the suffocating silence of duty. A boy who fled. He was small for his age. 11 maybe, slight of frame, sharp of eyes, his voice rarely used, though not by choice. In the agage there was no space for chatter. He had been taken from his family at 7, like all Spartan boys, pulled from the softness of his mother's lap and dropped into the furnace of discipline. he endured for 4 years. He endured the beatings, the hunger, the silence, the humiliations. He endured the chill of sleeping with no blanket, the cold of unspoken grief when a friend was punished in front of him and he was not allowed to look away or reach out. He endured the forced theft, the forced fasting, the ritualized cruelty passed down through generations of boys turned weapons. But he also remembered. He remembered a time before, the smell of olive oil warming in a clay lamp, the sound of his mother's humming as she stirred flour and honey into cakes, the press of her hand at the back of his neck, protective, constant. And perhaps that memory was the seed of his rebellion. It was not sudden. It began in glances, in the way his eyes lingered on the horizon during drills, in the way he traced the shadows of the guards' routes at night, in the way he stopped speaking altogether, not out of discipline, but because he feared that words might betray him, that if he said what he truly felt, the world would crack open. Then, one night, he left. He did not run. He walked, naked as all boys were made to sleep, his feet silent on the earth, practiced in stealth. He passed the others without a sound, avoided the sentries, followed the scent of pine, the slope of the land, downward, all was downward, toward the low fields, toward the helots. He found refuge in a village whose name the state had never bothered to learn. The helots did not turn him in, they should have. He was Spartan-born, their oppressor, their enemy. But they saw something else in him, something raw, terrified, human. A boy who had chosen escape over obedience, a boy who had broken the spell. They clothed him, hid him, taught him how to walk as one of them, how to carry the bundle of reeds, how to fake a limp to explain the lack of training scars, how to lower his gaze, to silence his diction, to breathe as though he had never been shaped for war. Years passed. He never returned. Sparta may have suspected. May have sent wordless punishments to his family, a withholding of rations, a refusal to name the mother in civic ceremonies. But no official search was made. To admit a boy had fled was to admit the system had cracked. So the silence held, and the boy lived. He grew into a man who could never speak his name aloud, who could not sleep in tight spaces, who flinched at raised voices even in joy, but who learned to harvest, to mend nets, to sing softly under his breath when no one listened. He became something Sparta could never imagine, not a warrior, not a martyr, not a servant, but a survivor. In time, he whispered his story to another boy, perhaps his son, perhaps not. It doesn't matter. The words passed on. A tale of a boy who chose to run, who chose not to lift a spear, who chose not to let the silence eat him alive. And though his name is lost, his choice remains, not carved in stone, but carried in breath, in the hush between wind and memory. In the knowledge that even in Sparta, even under the weight of discipline so fierce it could silence grief, there was a boy who chose to live. The moon rests heavy above the dark hills of Laconia, casting long silver shadows over the cracked stones of the past. The fires in the Spartan hearths have long gone cold. The voices that once echoed with drills and chants, with orders barked and punishments meted, have fallen into silence. And in this silence, now that the shields are laid down and the armor rusts untouched, we can ask the question that the city never dared to speak aloud. What did all of it leave behind? Not only in stone, not only in legend, but in the flesh and in the memory of those who bore the weight of Spartan glory. Beneath the admiration we have wrapped around Sparta, beneath the heroism, the discipline, the austere admiration in school books and cinema, there was always something else. There were boys. Thin, shivering boys pressed shoulder to shoulder in the dark, forbidden from crying when their bodies ached. There were mothers standing at the gates of training camps, their arms empty, their eyes dry, not because they did not feel, but because they were not allowed to. There were old men who walked the streets of their city after war, physically whole but unable to breathe without remembering the silence of their fallen. There was hunger, the real kind, and the kind that hollowed a soul. There was fear, taught like a language, spoken only inwardly. There was pain, admired, praised, enforced. Sparta was not a city of peace. It was a machine. It forged citizens who obeyed, who killed, who endured, and in that forging, so many selves were extinguished. Voices never found, gentleness never expressed, love never given without calculation. We remember the Spartans because they were exceptional, because they built something no one else dared to. But perhaps we also remember them because they lived the version of strength that still tempts us, the one that doesn't cry, the one that doesn't hesitate, the one that endures even when it costs everything. And perhaps that is why we so often forget the cost. The boys who didn't survive the agog, the women who were praised for birthing warriors but never held their sons again, the helots murdered in the dark to keep others sharp, the men who came home from war and found no way to exist in peace, the silent pain behind the perfection. Sparta calls to something in us, that deep ache to be invulnerable, to be revered, to be free of weakness. But it also warns us, because beneath its stone virtue lies a wound, a deep old wound carved by the belief that feeling is failure. So we end here, not with a hymn to glory, but with a breath. A long, slow breath, as if standing in the ruins of a place that once believed silence could protect the soul. And maybe in remembering them not only as warriors, but as wounded, we remember something in ourselves too. The part of us that breaks, the part that mourns, the part that survives. If this quiet descent into the past has spoken to you, I would be deeply grateful if you offered a silent click on the like button and perhaps subscribed for more winding explorations through the haunting and intricate corridors of history. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.